words have this peculiarity. They may be hidden, but they never close. Always painful, always ready to bleed. When touched, they remain fresh and open in the heart. Alexander Dumas, The Count of Monte Cristo. The Count of Monte Cristo is one of my favorite stories. Any Count of Monte Cristo fans? It's okay if you've just seen the movie, you can count yourself in the group. Perhaps you're familiar with the basic plot, even if you haven't read the book, or watched the movie. See, I was trying to help you out there. It's the story of a man named Edmond Dantes who is jealously betrayed, falsely accused by his best friend, a man he really considers to be his brother, the Count Mondego, a man of deep and painful moral wounding is Dantes. After years of languishing in prison, Dantes escapes and finds treasure on the small island of Monte Cristo. He returns to Parisian society, now a wealthy man, and yet still a wounded man. And Dantes believes God has rescued him for a purpose, for the purpose of revenge. I, who have been betrayed, assassinated, and cast into a tomb, I have emerged from that tomb by the grace of God. And I owe it to God to take my revenge, says Dantes. He has sent me for that purpose. Here I am. Here he is, a man now adorned in power, poised for vengeance. Now disguised as the Count of Monte Cristo, his true identity concealed, Dantes reunites intentionally with his friend Mondego, who has since married his once fiancée, the love of his life, Mercedes. And in the movie adaptation, I'm helping you movie people out here, we see Dantes is so determined to maintain his vengeful agenda that he refuses even to reveal his true identity, as the love of his life, Mercedes, recognizes him for who he is. His wounded heart, calloused, self-protective, is unable to receive the very love that he most deeply longs for. This is a man now, alone in his pain. A man whose only companions are his wealth and his rage. A man determined to conceal his identity so as to hide those wounds. A man determined to never be hurt again. Determined to forget the love he once had. And it will take an entire story for Dantes to willingly remember. I love this story. Anyone love this story? If you haven't read it or watched the movie yet, maybe you now will be interested. Perhaps I love this story because, as most good stories are wont to do, it reminds me of the great story. That is to say, God's story of Holy Scripture. But more specifically, it reminds me of one particular story in the Bible. The story of a man named Joseph. Joseph, who, like Dantes, is jealously betrayed and falsely accused by his brothers. The story of a man who, like Dantes, knows the pain, the deep pain of moral wounding in his life. A man who, like Dantes, goes from the pit of prison to the pinnacle of power. A man who knows the nightmare of a cursed, fallen world, but who is blessed by the dreams of God. It's a story that most of us probably, if we grew up in the church or have been around Biola for any length of time, are fairly familiar with. But perhaps, like the narrative of the Count of Monte Cristo, we know the kind of surface brushstrokes that form the basic picture. But we're not as acquainted with the layers underneath that communicate the depth. This morning, I want to draw our attention there together, to the depth of Joseph's story. The story, perhaps surprisingly, I think at least surprisingly, takes up 13 chapters in the book of Genesis, 50 chapters if you're counting, providing a really peculiar degree of detail about the life of this man, Joseph, that we don't get in the lives of others. Adam, Noah, even Abraham, Isaac, or Jacob. Details about the relational dynamics of his life, of his family. And this morning, we will give our attention to Genesis 41 and 42 in particular, where we encounter Joseph in the middle of his journey from Jacob's house to Pharaoh's house. And here in Genesis 41 and 42, we encounter a man now of great wealth, but yet still a man of great wounds. As we'll see in our passage, if you want to turn there, you can kind of look with me in the text as we walk through this sermon. As we see in our passage, such wounds may be hidden, but to borrow the words of Dumas, they have not been closed. Despite all of Joseph's attempts to forget them and to conceal them, they remain fresh and open in his heart. Now, at the end of Genesis 41, we see this man, Joseph, whose life had been a nightmarish pilgrimage from one pit to another, literally, now in a dream job, governor over the land of Egypt under Pharaoh. And it would appear, if we just kind of pop into the story right here, that the trauma of his birth family has been healed by the gift of a new family. At least that appears to be what Joseph himself perceives to be what is going on, the hope that Joseph himself has. If you're looking at the text, we read this in Genesis 41, verses 50 to 52. Before the year of famine came, 2 sons were born to Joseph. Asenath, the daughter of Potiphar, priest of On, bore them to him. And Joseph called the name of the firstborn Manasseh, for he said, God has made me forget all my hardship and all my father's house. And the name of the second he called Ephraim, for God has made me fruitful in the land of my affliction. Joseph's life, once a nightmare, has become a dream. Pain and loss have been replaced here by joy and life, literally. God has blessed Joseph with 2 sons, Manasseh and Ephraim. Joseph views the birth of these 2 sons as a kind of rebirth for himself, a fresh start for his life. Notice the meaning of the 2 names. We're actually told them in the text. To forget and to be fruitful. With this new family, Joseph intends to forget his painful past and to live into a fruitful future. To put off his birth identity as the son of Jacob and to put on his new identity as the father of Manasseh and Ephraim. Joseph recognizes this as a work of God's provisional grace in his life, and indeed it is. At this point in the story, I think we ought to probably rightly declare with Joseph, yes and amen, in celebrating God's blessing of new life. And yet, I think also we're right to wonder something here. Is this God's intention with the blessing? For Joseph to forget his past and cling to a future. To forget that he is the son of Jacob, the grandson of Isaac, the great-grandson of Abraham. To forget that he has brothers. To forget, we might say, his painful origin story. Here I think we would do well to not forget ourselves his origin story, but to remember Joseph's birth. Genesis 30, verses 22 to 24. Then God remembered Rachel, and God listened to her and opened her womb. She conceived and bore a son and said, God has taken away my reproach. And she called his name Joseph, saying, may the Lord add to me another son. Wasn't it God who added Joseph, that's the literal meaning of his name, to this family line of blessing? Had the God who remembers forgotten that? Was he calling Joseph to forget that? We might wonder, is there something of folly here in Joseph's aim, his interpretation of the blessing? A desire to heal his wounds by scrubbing his memory. Surely to forget one part of his story would be, if we're paying attention to the whole of his story, to forget the point of his story. To forget the cruel nightmare of his life would be to forget the graced dream given within it. Indeed, what we'll see as we move into Genesis 42 is just when Joseph wishes to forget, God makes him remember. As it turns out, the God who provided him with a dream is providentially guiding the story, that is to say, the whole story of his life, with meticulous care. God's grace only operating, of course, as it always does within true stories. God's providential guidance and care has led Joseph out of his pain, out of the pit of his life, yes, but God doesn't stop there. He's leading Joseph towards healing. The blessing God intends for Joseph's life isn't just royal status, not even a new family, but it's the blessing spoken of in Psalm 133. Behold, how good and pleasant it is when brothers dwell in unity. For there the Lord has commanded the blessing. You see, God is not content, as Joseph appears to be, with a peace built on familial estrangement. We'll just go our separate ways. That would be a peace, I imagine, that Joseph could understand. No, God has a peace in mind that, shall we say, surpasses understanding. A true peace of heart that comes from true relational peace. This is, in fact, the providential plot of the remainder of Joseph's story. But here in Genesis 42, we see the initial plans of a divine conspiracy to make such peace and bring such a blessing. Such a plan of blessing begins in remembrance. At the close of Genesis 41, we see that all the earth is coming to Egypt to buy grain from Joseph because of a severe famine over all the earth. And as Genesis 42 begins, we see that one family is included in that all. Wouldn't you know it? Joseph's family, Jacob's household. And Jacob instructs his 10 sons, minus Benjamin, to go to Egypt and buy grain. And so we read in verse 5, thus the sons of Israel came to buy among the others who came, for the famine was in the land of Canaan. And what happens when the brothers arrive? Well, they come before Joseph to buy grain. Now think about this for a moment. We might be familiar with the story, so it's like, oh, that's just what happens. But think about how preposterous this is. What are the chances of that? With the luck of man, such things are impossible. But with the providence of God, all things are possible. And what did Joseph's brothers do as they come before Joseph? We'll read it there in verse 6, if you're following along. Joseph's brothers came and bowed themselves before him with their faces to the ground. If you remember the beginning of Joseph's story, you know this is a significant moment. It's a moment we've been waiting for, isn't it? In Genesis 37, Joseph's story begins with God giving him a dream in which heads of grain, symbolizing his brothers, all come and bow down before one head of grain, symbolizing himself. The dream of God has been fulfilled here. And in this fulfillment, what does the Joseph of Pharaoh's house, the man so determined to forget his father Jacob's house, do? He remembers. Verse 9 of chapter 42. And Joseph remembered the dreams that he had dreamed of them. God has called him to remembrance. Forgetful Joseph remembers. His past now has become his present. The dream of his newly formed life swallowed up by the God dream of his real life. And what does Joseph do with this providential fulfillment of his dream? Does he receive it as a blessing or as a curse? Does he embrace this divinely orchestrated reunion with his betraying brothers? What will he do? Will he pursue revenge like Dantes or reconciliation? Well, if you know the story, you know where this is headed. We're headed towards reconciliation, aren't we? But here in Genesis 42, we're witnessing something different along the way. Here we witness a Joseph that reminds us a bit of Edmond Dantes, one that appears to be interested in revenge of some kind. His response to this unwanted family reunion perhaps is best captured by one other line of Dantes from Dumas's classic. I wish to be Providence myself, for I feel that the most beautiful, noblest, most sublime thing in the world is to recompense and punish. There's the heart of the revenge, isn't it? It appears Joseph here has recompense and punishment on his mind. How so, you ask? Well, let's look at the text a bit more. The painful moral wounds in Joseph's heart, inflicted by his brothers, is now touched, is now bleeding by their presence. The bandage of forgetfulness simply didn't work. And so now he must resort to another mode of self-protection, deception, falsehood, lies. While Joseph's brothers don't recognize him, does he recognize them? Oh, yes. He recognizes them. And rather than revealing his true identity, he decides to do what? Conceal it. Ironically, Joseph lies throughout the interaction while his brothers, who are the known liars up to this point in the story, demonstrate the first whispers of honesty in their lives. Joseph, in fact, goes so far as to accuse them of lying by himself lying. Now, that's quite a lie, isn't it? Joseph isn't just concerned with protecting himself, he's likewise concerned with punishing his brothers. Here we see clearly just how little he has actually forgotten. For his strategies of recompense in the text, they remarkably mirror the very wounds that his brothers inflicted upon him. We pick up on this right away in verse 7 of Genesis 42, where we read this. Joseph treated his brothers as, quote, strangers and spoke roughly to them. This is how the story of Joseph and his brothers began, but in reverse. We read in Genesis 37, verse 4, they hated him and could not speak peacefully to him. Joseph then goes on to accuse his brothers of being what? Anyone know the story? Spies. Oh, that sounds familiar as well. Again, if we look back to Genesis 37, where the story began, we discover that Joseph is the one slinking about, unbeknownst to his brothers, watching them and their behavior and going back and reporting it to their father. It's what in my household is often referred to as a tattletale. Not sure if you're familiar with this. Not really a fan favorite of most of the rest of my households. But we might call this spying. Spying. And beyond that, we do well to notice what Joseph does with all of his lies. He levies a false accusation against his brothers. He knows what that is like, doesn't he? Oh, he knows what that's like. And it's precisely what Potiphar's wife did to him in Genesis 39 and where that led, that Joseph intends to lead his brothers with false accusation. Lands them in prison. We read in verse 17, and he put them all together in custody for 3 days. Do you see it? Far from forgetting, Joseph has kept a very precise record of wrongs, hasn't he? As I noted earlier, throughout Joseph's game of deception with his brothers, known for their deception and cruelty, they demonstrate this kind of surprising whisper of honesty, even going so far as to acknowledge they have another brother who is no more. This honesty even showing up in the form of regret in the text. They don't offer a full-throated confession, but they do begin to acknowledge their wrongdoing. In verse 21, in truth, we're guilty concerning our brother, in that we saw the distress of his soul when he begged us and we did not listen. That's why this distress has come upon us. In the face of false accusations and imprisonment, the brothers' consciences are pinged. They view all that has transpired as God's just punishment. And perhaps it is. Maybe God is indeed putting them to the test. Indeed, even though Joseph may mean it for revenge, God may mean it for good. Unbeknownst to the brothers, Joseph overhears this little private conversation of pseudo-confession. And amidst all of his attempts to conceal his true identity, to secure his revenge, we see the wounds of Joseph's trauma show up. They remain fresh and open in his heart. We read this in verse 24. Then he turned away from them and wept. there it is. Joseph remembers his pain and his sorrow and his loss. He remembers what he has tried so hard to forget. And here we see why he didn't want to reveal his identity, why he still doesn't want to reveal his identity. Because if he does, he reveals not just his newfound glory, but his deep and abiding pain. Could it be that Joseph, freed from jail and seated in glory, is yet still not totally free? Could this be what God is up to in his life? Could it be that the only thing that will set him free is the truth? Could it be that God did not rescue him for revenge, but for remembrance? Could it be that God has fulfilled his dream not just for the sake of his ruling over his brothers, but for the sake of him being reconciled to his brothers? Could it be that God desires to teach Joseph, the blessed one, who has now been a blessing to all the nations of the earth, fulfilling God's plan of blessing? Could it be that what God yet still seeks to teach him is what it is to bless those who curse him? Could it be that God wants to heal his broken heart? Well, of course, a full answer to those questions will have to require a full reading of the story of Joseph, won't it? But for now, in closing, what I want us to notice here in Genesis 41 and 42, midway through Joseph's life and story, I want us to notice and pay attention to the place where God's plan of healing begins. Healing begins in remembering with God all that we try so desperately to forget. Joseph's life in so many ways is a nightmare. But his life is defined ultimately not by such suffering and hardships, but by the words of Genesis 39. The Lord was with Joseph. The Lord was with Joseph in the pit. The Lord was with Joseph in prison. The Lord was with Joseph when he was brought before Pharaoh to interpret dreams. Could it be that the Lord will be with him in the painful memories of his life? And while Joseph wants to forget, God is calling him to remember the whole way that the Lord his God has led him. This is where God's grace always meets us in reality, in the whole story of our lives, not just in parts. It's for this reason we must not endeavor to scrub the record, as painful as it may be. Because God's providential plan, his transformative grace, they're only known in our authentic histories. The wounds of our lives are only healed by God's presence. And our attempts to hide from them by forgetfulness or cover them over with the pretense of a better life and future, those things, those strategies, they are, of course, but the inheritance of Adam and Eve, who in their sins scrambled to hide and cover the truth of their lives before God. The truth is, brothers and sisters, all of our attempts to forget and conceal, they are a fool's errand anyways. Joseph believed he could make himself forget, but could he? No. What is hidden in our hearts will be revealed. Joseph's wounded heart was beating with anger and sadness. The reunion with his brothers only exposed what was already there. And if such anger and sadness had not come out towards them, if he hadn't bled in that moment, he would have bled in another. It would have leaked out in his relationship with his wife, leaked out in his relationship with his children. For painful memories, moral wounds are lodged in the human soul like an encrypted file. They might be buried deep, folder within folder within folder within folder, guarded by a code that we have made up, that we are assured no one will ever know, but they are easily hacked in my experience, and their sensitive data exposed when we least expect it. Another moment, another betrayal, another loss, another injury, another painful experience of seeking to love and not receiving love in return. And in that instant, the deep pain of our past can become our present in ways unexpected. And so the truth is, dear brothers and sisters, a life of hidden anger and sorrow, it is a danger to us. But it is likewise a danger to others. Who knows what harm an angry and sorrowful Joseph may cause to others? Remember Cain and Abel? It was Cain's anger and sadness, we're told very specifically, that drove him to murder. Joseph, the one who has been able to his brother's Cain thus far in the story, could just as easily become the Cain to his brother's Abel if his wounds are kept hidden and are allowed to fester. God calls us to remember our lives with him. Only God's healing presence, his witness, can heal the hidden wounds of our lives. This is precisely what God intends to show Joseph. He wants to make him remember for the sake of healing. It's here in the remembrance of his pain and loss that the God who has been with him in the pit, every pit of his life, is with him yet still. A God who heals the brokenhearted and binds up their wounds. When our wounds are touched by God, then they are healed.
Discover who you're called to be at Biola University, a leading Christ-centered university in Los Angeles, with programs on campus and online. Subscribe for more of our videos and learn more at biola.edu.